So, wir werden langsam beginnen. And I switch in English. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. My name is Éva Kovács, and it is my honor to welcome you all in this workshop, our workshop, Nazis and Nazi sympathizers in South America after 1945. We are grateful to Linda Erker, of course, the initiator of this workshop, to Marianne Winsberger, Miriam Karoli, and Miriam Wilhelm, members of the organizing group, and to all of my colleagues at the YWI who have put together such a beautiful program for you and for us. I also welcome to our cooperation partners across Austria. We are fortunate enough to be supported by the University of Vienna, the Nationalfonds and the Zukunftsfonds, and we would also like to thank our cooperation partners, the Paris Lodron University in Salzburg and the Ibero-American Institute. And we are also happy to have special guests, not yet, but maybe they will come at our workshop. Tonight we will have a podium discussion in which two representatives of the Simon Wiesenthal Center and one of the founders of our institute, all of them knew Simon Wiesenthal in person, will discuss the legacy of Simon Wiesenthal, Ephraim Zurov, Shimon Samuels, and Brigitte Beiler. They are also welcome to our workshop. It is the privilege of the Wiesenthal Institute to host the archive of one of the most important Nazi hunters who devoted his whole life to searching for Nazi perpetrators. In 1945, Wiesenthal used the temporary presence of the survivors, thousands of whom were waiting in DP camps for a chance to emigrate, to systematically question them as witnesses of the crimes of injustices they had suffered. Hundreds of witnesses were thereby recruited to testify at American and later also at Austrian trials. Due to the mass emigration of survivors that began in 1948, this chapter in Life of Wiesenthal was rather short, yet it led to the foundation for Wiesenthal's lifelong activities. In 1956, he donated the bulk of the materials that had been compiled in Linz to the archive of Yad Vashem, where they are still today. However, Wiesenthal kept the rest of the material and took it with him to Vienna, and with the establishment of the Documentation Center of the Association of Jewish Victims of the Nazi regime, Wiesenthal opened a new office in Vienna in the autumn 1961 and resumed the work he had begun in Linz. In the following 4 decades, he collected a large number of documents relating to Nazi crimes that are now accessible in 8,000 folders, the so-called brown boxes. Today you will get a foretaste of his unique collection in our guided tour through the Simon Wiesenthal archives. And let me continue with the short welcome address of Susanne Heim. Dear participants, it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the International Advisory Board of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute to this workshop. I am happy that after so many months of only virtual meetings due to the pandemic, this workshop can take place as a face-to-face event, which I'm sure will lead to a more fruitful exchange. At the same time, I'm also sorry that since this is not a Zoom meeting, I can't join the workshop. Susanne is currently in New York. Especially after having read all the abstracts to the talks you will be going to hear during the upcoming 2 days, I regret this even more. It's impressive how many interesting questions there are still to be researched and discussed regarding the notorious flight of Nazis to South America about 30 years after the study of Ernst Klee on the topic and after 15 years after the books of Uki Godis and Gerald Steinachers about the Red Line. The paper to be presented at this conference explore the frightening biographical continuities and the persistence of extremely flexible networks across continents and turns of time. They show how even high-ranking politicians or scholars who played an important role in the Nazi era managed to make a second career in South America, or when returning to Germany or Austria after some time of cooling down. When reading these papers, I started questioning myself how these people did adjust to the changed post-World War societies. They could rely on helpers and like-minded people. But what about the continuities of contents and concepts? After having contributed to Nazi political, economic, or scholarly concept, to what degree did they have to remodel this concept and even their language to make it fit for the conditions of Western post-war societies and the Cold War? Did they just have to pretend to do some kind of camouflage? And how far did their influence reach? How far can it be traced in the new environment, the post-war academic institutions, the press, or the German Secret Service? This is, I have liked to ask at many of the speakers of this workshop, and if I could have taken part. Maybe you will touch some of these questions in your discussions. The role of the advisory board is to support the Institute's initiatives, make suggestions, discuss its program, and draw attention to recent developments in Holocaust research. But of course, the main work in developing the program and realizing it is done by the staff of the Institute. Susanne is extremely nice to us. I can speak for the entire academic advisory board in saying that we are all impressed with what the Institute has put together in the past few years. And I'm convinced that this workshop will be another highlight in the Institute series of events. Therefore, I want to thank the staff of the Vienna Institute, especially Éva Kovács and Marianne Winsberger, as well as Linda Erker from the Vienna University for organizing this. I wish you all a very interesting and inspiring discussion. Thank you all. Susanne Heim, and I can just repeat what Susanne said. So, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Eva. Thank you. Éva Kovács, Deputy Director in Academic Affairs of the Wiesenthal Institute, and also thank you to Susanne Heim, member of the International Advisory Board of the Wiesenthal Institute. Also, on my behalf, as a member of the Department of Contemporary History at the University of Vienna, I want to welcome all of you to our workshop, Nazi and Nazi Sympathizers in South America after 1945. Well, as you already know, the workshop is organized by the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute of Holocaust-Studies and the University of Vienna, namely my department, the Department of Contemporary History at the university. But I really want to underline the cooperation, the great cooperation we have with the Department of History at the University of Salzburg. Margit Reiter, she will hopefully join us soon. And with the Ibero-American Institute Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation in Berlin. And I would like to welcome Sandra Carreras in this context. It's great to see you again. Allow me to take a brief look back. In August 2020, I contacted Bela Rashki, the managing director of the Wiesenthal Institute at this time, and told him that I would very much like to cooperate again with the Wiesenthal Institute. Again, because in 2013, I could already, I enjoyed a very successful cooperation for the first time with my colleagues, especially Philipp Rohrbach here at the Institute. We could organize a conference called Eichmann After Jerusalem, and we also worked together in a project called Austrian Heritage Archive, an archive which collects video and audio interviews with Jewish Austrian emigres who fled to the US or then Palestine or Israel during and after National Socialist period. And this project is also still here at the Institute. And with these very good experiences, I stood here again in 2020. And in the first two cooperations, I would say everything went very easy with the Institute's team and with a spirit of collegiality. And I want to thank for that. In few words, my idea in 2020 was, I just presented the idea saying I would love to work something out together on the topic of National Socialists in South America and the involvement of Wiesenthal, and in order to get to know actually also the Institute's archive and Wiesenthal's collection. I wanted to invite experts to Vienna to meet here and to discuss and to learn from each other. And I think it's great that immediately I got the fully support of the whole Wiesenthal Institute. Well, I don't want to mention that COVID maybe gave us some more challenges on the way. I think the good thing is we are here today. We are not on Zoom. I really appreciate that you all came to Vienna. And for that, I want to say thank you. Personally, I want to say thank you to the Wiesenthal Institute's team, and first with thank you to Éva Kovács, Marianne Winsberger, Miriam Karoli, Angelika Brechelmacher, Jana Starek, Sandro Fasching, and Hans Ljung. And I also want to thank 3 colleagues of us. They are supporting us in the next 2 days. I think you already met them, Christoph Zinnenburg, Fabian Wimmer, and Ivana Gavrilovic. They're helping here, out there, and writing the conference report. Thank you very much for your support. Many thanks to Kerstin von Lingen. She's my team leader at the Department of Contemporary History, and she was supporting my idea and actually all of my ideas since I started my postdoc from the very beginning. Thank you very much to the commentators of our conference, because they won't be they will be talking and giving comments, but I want to name them. So you have them present as well, because their work I really appreciate. Sandra Carreras from Berlin, Margit Reiter from Salzburg, Dorothee Schlüter from Weimar, Erhard Stackel from Vienna, and again, Kerstin von Lingen, Vienna. Thank you to all participants and to the audience to be here, to get tested with a PCR test. I know sometimes it was, or for some of you, it was a little bit more work to organize it. And thank you for sending us the paper in advance so we could circulate them and prepare ourselves much better. Let me say maybe 4 points about organizational aspects. First of all, we have 2 small changes in the program. The colleagues Gustavo Guzman and Christian Zwick, they can't attend at the conference. In your folders, you got the updated program, and there you will see after our keynote of Raanan Rein, we will immediately change to the guided tour through the Wiesenthal archive. This is one of our switches. Let me tell you that you're going to be spoiled by the Wiesenthal Institute with food and coffee breaks. I would suggest that in the beginning of the first break, we will give you the idea where to find everything. Tonight we can enjoy the possibility to have a panel discussion down there. I think you passed by the bookshop Singer. You're all welcome at the panel discussion, and they will have some small snacks as well, so the spoiling you continues in the evening. And for all the participants of the conference, we want to let you know that tomorrow in the closing session, starting at 3:15, we'll also discuss and exchange ideas about the publication. So we have time for that tomorrow. And now maybe some words about the workshop. After one postponement and I guess a few changes in all our lives, we will be here for the next 2 days. We will hopefully discuss a lot. I would love us to exchange knowledge about archives, articles, ideas, patterns and persons, and other perspectives on history. And so I'm very much looking forward to start the workshop now. In our program, we have at least 4 axes that will cross and hopefully also complement each other's, at least sometimes. I would say first we have places and players, as we will see, for example, in the panel, Rome as a hub of Nazis on the run. Second, we have multipliers of ideas and contacts, especially we will examine this on propagandists, secret services, and German embassies. We also have biographical case studies of former National Socialists with a focus on Austrian National Socialists, but not exclusively. And I hope the aim here is perhaps to also find overreaching patterns in their biographies, so using their case studies to open a broader picture. And the 4th point would be we will challenge the existing narratives about dazzling personalities and/or countries in the center of historiographical or sometimes even mainstream attention. And I would say this leads me directly to the topic of our keynote and our keynote speaker, Raanan Rein. Well, the title of your keynote, Raanan, is From the Blue Book to the CEANA Report and Back, Narratives of Argentina's Complicity with the Third Reich and the Nazi Fugitives. I present you in a short way. so you can start immediately. Raanan Rein is professor of Latin American Spanish history and former vice president of Tel Aviv University. He is also the head of the S. Daniel Abrams Center for International and Regional Studies. And Raanan is the author and editor of more than 40 books and well over 100 of articles in academic journals and book chapters in several languages. He is a member of the Argentinian National Academy of History and former president of the Latin American Jewish Studies Association. And Raanan, thank you very much that you followed our invitation to Vienna, and I'm very much looking forward to your talk. I would suggest I invite you immediately to the place over there. And you get some water, of course.
Yes, you can also
thank you.
You promised to spoil us for some water.
Yeah, talking about spoiling, not even serving you the water. If you mind, I'll also I'll place myself over there. Thank you.
Shalom, guten Tag. It is a great pleasure for me to be here with you today, and I would like to start by thanking the organizers of this conference and the hosts of this conference. First of all, of course, the Simon Wiesenthal Institute. So thank you so much to Éva Kovács and the entire team here at the Wiesenthal Center. Of course, to my friend and colleague, Dr. Linda Erker, for being the, not just the initiator, not just the organizer, but the soul behind this conference. So thank you so much. Unlike many of the papers that will be presented here today and tomorrow, in which focus mostly on specific cases or specific individuals, my aim is to draw a kind of a broader picture and also introduce the comparative perspective in order to rethink some of the common assumptions as to the flight of Nazis, Nazi war criminals, Nazi sympathizers to South America, and more specifically to challenge the image of Argentina as being the country which was a kind of a paradise for Nazis, not just in Latin America, but in the entire world. So, on the eve of the 1946 presidential elections in Argentina, the US State Department published a 130-page booklet titled Consultation, let's see if it works better without eyeglasses, among the American republics with respect to the Argentine situation. The publication, known also as the Blue Book, allegedly exposed the military government's connections to the Axis powers, as well as the country's supposed plan to subvert other Latin American nations and bring about the Fourth Reich. More importantly, the book made harsh accusations against the presidential candidate, Colonel Juan Domingo Perón. The publication failed to achieve its main goal, that is to abort Perón's election, but it became a key element in the construction of Argentina's image as a pro-Nazi country and of Juan Perón as a Nazi collaborator. Decades later, in the 1990s, a Peronist president, Carlos Saúl Menem, established the Commission of Inquiry into the Activities of Nazis in Argentina, known by its acronym CEANA, as you could see in the title of my talk. That was in order to portray a more balanced picture of the entry and influence of Nazis, and especially war criminals in Argentina in the post-war period. The CEANA also failed in its efforts to challenge Argentina's image as a safe haven for Nazis. So on the one hand, a failure by American diplomacy to avoid the electoral triumph of Perón. On the other hand, a failure of the Republic of Argentina to somewhat better its image in the Western public opinion. In May 2020, under yet another Peronist president, Alberto Fernandez, the current president of Argentina, the choice of Perón's former health minister, Ramón Carrillo, to feature on a 5,000 peso banknote sparked a controversy. Carrillo was accused of being an admirer of Hitler, who also provided refuge to the Danish fugitive Buchenwald camp doctor Karl Peter Warnet, allowing him to continue experiments with homosexuals to heal them, quote unquote. Every now and then, in fact, quite often, the enduring myth reemerges, according to which Argentina stood out in the world for having been a country in which A, Nazism had a special gravitation, and B, Argentina was the country which served as a great refuge for Nazi criminals. The myth was forged in the 1940s, especially after 1945, when anti-Peronism made a campaign trying to link Perón with Nazi Germany. Because of Argentina's neutrality in World War II, and later because of its irritation with Perón's social and economic policies, the United States, for its part, developed intense propaganda to associate the country with the Nazis as a way of discrediting it. Through the work of both the anti-Peronist opposition and the United States, the myth has been reproduced up to the present day. Let me give you several examples as to how strong is this myth in American popular culture, which periodically takes it up. For example, one of the films in the saga X-Men begins in Villa Gesell, but with a very peculiar twist. It is full of mountains, as if it were really Bariloche. The reference to the Nazis who took refuge in Argentina is never lacking. Many of you might remember the Soup Nazi episode in the sitcom Seinfeld. At the end of the chapter, already after the credits, one of the characters, Newman, tells Jerry that the Soup Nazi decided to leave the country and will go where to? He will go to live, obviously, in Argentina. And the election is not coincidental. And another and final, I promise you, example is the 1995 romantic comedy with Sandra Bullock, While You Were Sleeping. It's a silly American movie. There's no reason to pay attention to it, but there's a dinner scene in the film in which there is a reference to Argentina, and I would like us to watch about 20 seconds from this scene to make my point clear, if it works. That's a shame. It should have worked. Okay, so anyway, they're having a nice dinner, and they are chatting about beautiful or handsome men and beautiful women, etc., etc., and then one of the people wants to compliment the host about the wonderful dinner that they are having and the excellent dishes that she served, and especially the beef. She says that the beef is Argentine, and he says, oh, Argentina, they have excellent beef and many Nazis. Now, this shocked me when I saw the film. I have to admit that I saw it. I took a nephew of mine years ago, he was a young kid, to see the movie, because the movie doesn't talk about Argentina at all, does not discuss World War II, does not refer to Nazi Germany at all. But still, when the name of Argentina comes up, it is immediately associated with Nazism. So I think that by now my point is rather clear. Anti-Peronism, on the other hand, stubbornly holds on to this belief for obvious political reasons. Whenever there is a Peronist president in power, the opposition will find one way or another in order to link him or her and their political party to Nazism. There were even fantasies about Hitler finding refuge refuge in Argentina, Martin Bormann finding refuge in Argentina, and time and again, supposedly it was Perón personally who allowed Hitler to enter Argentina. So, as I said earlier, my paper will try to zoom out from specific cases in order to give a broader picture as to the political motivated narratives of Argentina's position in World War II and the entry of undoubtedly too many war criminals into this country in the post-war period. In many ways, what I want to argue is that in 2022, we are back to 1946 with the same image produced by the Blue Book. According to documents of the American Embassy in Buenos Aires, the neutral position of Argentina during the war was apparently shared or supported by the majority of Argentines, based in part on Argentina's neutrality during World War I, led by President Hipólito Yrigoyen, as well as on Argentina's geographical remoteness from the killing fields of Europe. 4 different presidents, 2 civilians and 2 militaries, favored this neutralist policy for various reasons. It wasn't one specific leader, one specific president, which decided to opt for neutrality. Until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, this policy did not provoke any meaningful tension between Argentina and the United States. However, from 1942, once the US entered the war, the policy of neutrality confronted Argentina with the hegemonic power of the North, with the United States. At any rate, and this is something that in different talks of mine I try to highlight again and again, the Allies' position with regards to Argentine neutrality was not unified. While the US expected Argentina to follow its leadership, in fact, this neutral policy of Argentina served the interest of Great Britain. It contributed to the survival of its civilian population bombarded by the Germans with food shipments from Argentine ports. In this way, by maintaining its policy of neutrality, Argentina contributed to the Allied victory over the Nazis. This is something that the vast majority of people tend to forget. In its food shipments to Great Britain, Argentina contributed to the Allied victory in World War II, the victory over the Nazis. If Argentina had declared war against the Third Reich, the German U-boats would have torpedoed the ships in their way to British airports. Now, let me introduce for a second a comparative perspective, which might enlighten a little bit our analysis of Argentine neutrality. The Blue Book well documented Argentina's failure to purchase military equipment from Germany. Specifically, it detailed the seizure of the German-born Argentine Oscar Helmuth in October 1943 by the British Navy in Trinidad en route to Spain. Helmuth, who posed as a Spanish consul, was supposedly to work out a kind of a triangular agreement between Argentina, Spain, and Germany, whereby Berlin would supply munitions in exchange for a free hand in intelligence gathering and fifth column operations in Argentina. We must contrast this Argentine failure with the policies of other neutral countries. Take Turkey, for example. Turkey successfully bought or purchased weapons from Germany. Take neutral Sweden, for example. Sweden even sold weapons to the Nazis without the US denigrating either Turkey or Sweden in the post-war era. And if we look at the case of Francisco Franco in Spain, Franco, as you all know, came to power at the end of a bloody civil war with the help of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. He kept a pro-German neutrality, not just neutrality and not just a formal, later on, non-intervention policy, but he also sent the Blue Division to fight alongside the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. But Franco became, in the post-war era, an ally of the United States. In 1953, the two countries signed an agreement for the establishment of American military bases on Spanish territory. Cold War considerations pushed aside the memories of the recent past as far as Spain was concerned, the Civil War and the pro-German neutrality. How convenient from the point of view of the United States. This was a picture from the meeting at Endai between Franco and Hitler. On the other hand, the US have never forgiven Argentina for its stubborn position in the 1930s and the 1940s and the resistance to American dictates. Historian Ronald Newton had already documented this American attitude in his 1992 book, The Nazi Menace in Argentina, 1931 to 1947. As you can see on the screen, the words Nazi menace appear in quotation marks, doubting in this way the existence of such a threat. The book convincingly showed that German activities during the war in Argentina posed no threat to the Allies and that Nazi Argentina was a myth. Newton also demonstrated that the United States response was out of proportion, not to say irrational, to any such supposed threat in Argentina. In his book, Justice, Not Vengeance, published in 1989, Simon Wiesenthal wrote that, and I quote, and you can see it on the screen, in Perón's Argentina, the Nazis exercised considerable power. They were the organizers of the Argentinian army, experts in Argentinian industrialization. The money added to the liquidity of Argentinian banks. Eichmann could feel secure in Argentina, end of quote. This claim was rather overstated, as are the frequent descriptions of the South American country as a paradise for Nazi criminals, where allegedly thousands of war criminals found refuge. This image, particularly the one that links the regime of Juan Perón, who ruled Argentina during a decade after the end of World War II, that is between 1946 and 1955. So this image, this link with Nazi Germany is still very present. But in fact, as has been pointed out in one of the Israeli Mossad's publication titled The Pursuit of Nazi War Criminals, and I quote, many of the most senior National Socialist criminals have disappeared, in quotations mark, in the silent refuge they have found among their families and made do throughout Germany and Austria. So first and foremost, we are talking about Germany and Austria, not about Argentina. In suitable jobs or in various businesses belonging to sympathizers with the Nazi cause. Many of them fled to distant destinations, to South America, to Arab countries, to Great Britain, to the United States, and even to Australia, end of quote. That is, the Mossad document, following decades of pursuit of Nazi war criminals, comes to the conclusions that they were spread all over. The document does not single out one specific country. Indeed, Argentina was not the only country in which war criminals and Nazi collaborators found refuge, although it must be said that certainly a good number of them went to Argentina after Germany's surrender and the end of World War II. In those years, like other countries, Argentina tried to encourage the migration of scientists, engineers, technicians, and military experts who were trained in interwar Germany and acquired their expertise there. Ironically, the United States and the Soviet Union, which had led the fight against Nazism, took a larger number than Argentina of German scientists, technicians, and military experts, while France, for example, accepted thousands of veterans of the SS in its Foreign Legion. It seems that German soldiers made up more than half of the Legion, the French Legion, during the war in Indochina. But people tend to focus on Argentina. Now, the Argentine intention was to incorporate these scientists and technicians in the development, industrialization, and modernization programs of that country. Among these immigrants were, of course, also Nazis and sympathizers of Hitler's regime. Argentine physicists, and there are better experts than myself here about the about his trajectory. Ronald Richter began Argentina's nuclear program near Bariloche. Kurt Tank, a Luftwaffe aerodynamics expert, created in the province of Córdoba the Fábrica Militar de Aviaciones, the military aircraft manufacturing facility, and took his entire staff there. Several former Luftwaffe officers were test pilots of the new Argentine aeronautical industry, and the most prominent one among them was Hans Ulrich Rudel, a war pilot who had received several decorations and returned to Germany in 1952, where he was involved in neo-Nazi activities until his death in 1982. The height of Tank's achievement in Argentina was the production of the Pulqui DOS fighter. Pulqui means arrow in the Mapuche language, and many Argentines are still today proud of this accomplishment, this achievement. Several Nazi sympathizers who went to Argentina found their place in academic institutions, of which perhaps the most prominent example is the National University of Tucumán. The inflow of German-speaking immigrants was not the result of a systematic and targeted government policy as sustained by the hugely popular, the great bestseller of Ukigoni, the Real Odessa, How Perón Brought the Nazi War Criminals to Argentina. In his book, Goni, who is cited in several of the papers that we will hear today and tomorrow, claimed that the Perons created a kind of a secret team in order to rescue Nazi leaders in Europe after the end of World War II. A team which included Nazi fugitives among its members. It was supposedly masterminded by the former SS captain, Carlos Horst Fulner, and Fulner and his company Capri will also be mentioned here in a couple of papers, as well as by Rodolfo Rudi Freude, the son of Ludwig Freude, the Allies' most wanted Nazi agent in Argentina. But the team also included Pierre Dailly, sentenced to death by a Belgian tribunal in 1947 for his collaboration with the Nazi occupation, Jacques-Marie de Maillet, a Nazi anthropologist and former officer of the Waffen-SS in France, and Branko Benson, the ambassador to Berlin of the Croatian pro-Nazi government until 1943. However, historical research points to the fact that it was relatively easy to obtain entry visas at Argentine consulates in Europe or directly from the Directorate of Migration, more often than not by bribing officials. So, in a way, our attention should be focused more, I say it with some caution, on the network in Europe which allowed and encouraged the flight of Nazis to South America, more than on the supposed elaborated and well-designed program of the Perón government to recruit as many Nazis, as many war criminals as possible and bring them to Argentina. So there are several examples. I'm a bit hesitant whether to enter into details because Klaus, for example, is going to talk specifically about the role of this Austrian bishop and about the long and winding road that took many of these Nazis to South America. Various international actors also pressured Argentina to accept immigrants, even if they had been Hitler sympathizers or admirers, for fear of what might happen to them in the areas occupied by the Red Army. At least since 1947, US policy focused on rebuilding Europe and slowing communist progress, while the location of war criminals and their collaborators lost importance. It should also be noted that already in the 19th century, Argentine liberal elites, as those of other Latin American countries, like Chile or Brazil, expressed their preference for immigrants from Central and Northern Europe as part of their project to improve, quote unquote, or whiten, quote unquote, their populations. In this respect, Argentina's migration policies throughout the 19th and 20th centuries remained consistent. There was no sudden rupture or change as far as the encouragement of German immigration to Argentina. As to the general numbers of Germans and Austrians arriving in Argentina, Holger Medding is certainly the expert. I'm quoting mostly numbers from his earlier work, but, and again, you can find it in the text of my paper, but one has to make, here I state the obvious, but somehow it's not always kept, this distinction between the various categories. We should make a clear distinction between war criminals and German immigrants who were sympathizers of the regime, who were members of the National Socialist Party, or even people who held senior positions in the German states. They do not enter into the very specific, clear legal definition of war criminals. And if we talk about war criminals, according to accepted estimates nowadays, about 50 to 60 of these immigrants were indeed war criminals. 50 to 60, too many, that's for sure, but far away from the idea of thousands of war criminals finding their way into Argentina. The most notorious of them were, of course, Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele, the angel of death. Mengele arrived in Argentina in June 1949 with counterfeit documents under the name of Helmut Gregor. He fled to Paraguay in late 1959 or maybe even in early 1960, and after a brief stay there, settled in Brazil, where he died in 1979. Eichmann, as you all know, arrived in 1950 also with false documents under the name of Ricardo Clement. And on this infamous list of war criminals who arrived in Argentina, we could add, and I won't go into detail, Walter Kutschmann from Galicia, Ricardo, who came with the name of Andres Ricardo Olmo, Edward Roschmann, commander of the Riga ghetto, Erich Priebke, Josef Schwamberger, Klaus Barbie, or Barbie, however you pronounce it here, etc. Some of these war criminals were sought after by Nazi hunters for many years before being extradited to Germany, France, or Italy to stand trial for their crimes against humanity. The Argentine authorities, however, made no considerable effort to locate and convict them. And this is also a point that I would like to highlight, because Perón was deposed in 1955, where the following presidents, civilian or military, willing to consider the extradition of Nazi war criminals to European countries? Not at all. So when Argentine opposition focuses the discussion on the Perón government, in a way, it avoids a kind of an effort to discuss the responsibility of the Argentine society as a whole, as far as the entry and the refuge given to Nazi war criminals. So for non-Argentines, it's only Argentina, and you leave aside other countries who also, which also opened their doors to Nazi war criminals. When we talk about the domestic arena in Argentina, the focus on the Perón government, in a way, takes away responsibility from most of Argentine society. But again, in this, Argentina was not particular in any way. The same thing happened in neighboring countries, as can be seen in the case of the Chilean refusal to hand over Walter Rauff to the justice of the Federal Republic of Germany. Again, I won't go into details because of lack of time. The defeat of the Axis powers led not only Germans and Austrians to emigrate to Argentina. Thousands of Ukrainians, Croats, Poles, Belarusians, Serbs, and others escaped from Soviet tanks and initially found refuge in Italy, then made their way to Argentina with the help of the Vatican, the International Red Cross, and American services as well. And again, I would avoid numbers. In the group of notorious war criminals or war collaborators, we could mention Ante Pavelic and the leaders of the Ustasha government in Croatia, Jan Durkanski, the Slovak leader responsible for the massacre of Czech civilians, Radoslav Ostrovsky, and again, the list is long, and it might include Mussolini's son and some key figures in fascist Italy. Okay. Going back to Braden and his campaign, I have what, 5-10 minutes more? 10, okay, perfect. The confrontation between the American ambassadors, Purell Braden and Colonel Juan Perón in late 1945 and early 1946 was one of the most dramatic episodes in US-Argentine relations in the 20th century and has had a lasting impact on bilateral ties for very many decades. In this sense, the so-called Blue Book was one of the most important documents in the creation of the myth that Argentina was a pro-Nazi and anti-Semitic nation. Indeed, the publication of the officially titled Consultation among the American Republics with respect to the Argentine situation on February 11th, less than 2 weeks before the February 24th general election, caused a sensation in Buenos Aires. It was, to use the words of John Cabot, the man in charge of US affairs in Argentina, like dropping an atomic bomb. Braden arrived in Argentina on May 19, 1945. He stayed only about 4 months in Buenos Aires, but succeeded in causing a serious damage to bilateral relations within such a short period of time. He later became a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Latin American Affairs, and from the US he continued his anti-Argentine campaign and proved even more disruptive to relations between his country and Argentina. If one reads the reports written by his successor, George Messersmith, the US ambassador in Buenos Aires, Messersmith cannot believe how newspapers like the New York Times or Washington Post describe Argentina as an enemy country and talk about it as a threat to the United States, and he tries to convince his superiors in Washington to change the policy, to change the attitude towards Argentina. Perón responded to the Blue Book with a book of his own, if you'd like, called La República Argentina ante el Libro Azul, the Argentine Republic in front of the Blue Book. And his book, quote unquote, was called Libro Azul y Blanco, the blue and white book using the colors of the Argentine flag, presenting the presidential election as if Braden or Braden, as he's called by the Argentines, was the other candidate, and the choice for Argentine was between the American diplomat and Perón. Hardly no one in Argentina remembers nowadays who was the opposition candidate running against Perón. His name was José Pascual Tamborini. Everybody remembers the Braden or Perón slogan. So Braden's aim was to portray Argentina as a threat to the inter-American system. Why was it? Because its government was Nazi-fascist. And why was it considered Nazi-fascist? Because it conspired to buy arms and get technicians from the Third Reich, because it planned to form a South American bloc favorable to Germany and hostile to the United States, because it allowed Axis espionage, because it let the Nazis use its media and school system to spread Nazi propaganda, and because it did not repatriate Nazis. Again, if you look at Argentine behavior on the repatriation of Nazis compared to other countries, the Argentine did a more or less okay job. I don't want to say decent job, but okay job. They didn't do worse than other countries in the region. The British explained to the Americans again and again that while it was true that several prominent Argentines flirted with the Nazis, the flow of products needed for the Allied war effort never stopped, and that Argentine neutrality ensured that no acts of sabotage against Argentine meatpacking plants, grain elevators, or port facilities serving the Allied cause could occur. They insisted that there was no evidence that German agents in Argentina caused the sinking of a single Allied ship. Moreover, the Argentine government reluctantly approached the German for arms only after the US refused to supply them. They supplied it to neighboring Brazil, even though the Americans were training the Argentine armed forces. In fact, Argentina did more to expel Nazis, so claimed the British, than countries like Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, or Mexico, without the latter being criticized, much less punished by the US administration. The Argentines, the British repeatedly insisted, were pursuing their own interests and not those of Germany. And it might be interesting for many of you to take a look at the memoir of the British ambassador in Buenos Aires, Sir David Kelly, and the title of his book is The Ruling Few, and he has amazing descriptions of Spool Braden and his activities. American historians like Joseph Talchin or the Canadian David Shainin, when they discuss US-Argentine relations at this time period, used medical and psychological vocabulary to describe Braden's campaign: irrational, obsessive, pathological, and others. Robert Potash, historian, was one of the first historians to conclude that the narrowness of Perón's victory suggests that it was, and I quote, more than likely that the Blue Book served to tip the balance in Perón's favor. And Perón himself at one point said that if Braden never existed, I should have invented him in order to win the elections. So let me go towards the conclusions, I'm not concluding yet, almost, and move to the recent controversy over the bill carrying Ramon Carrillo's image. This happened only a year and a half ago. The choice of Perón's former health minister, Ramon Carrillo, to feature on this banknote provoked, as I said, a heated debate, and Carrillo was accused by opposition members as well as by two ambassadors, unfortunately the Israeli ambassador and the British ambassador, of being an admirer of the Führer. Where did this accusation against Carrillo come from? First of all, by the same logic that makes that if Perón was assigned by the War Ministry to study mountain warfare in the Italian Alps in 1939, it means that he was a fascist, or he became a fascist in Italy just because he served several months in Italy in 1939. So if Carrijo visited Germany in the early 1930s, wouldn't that necessarily mean that he became a Nazi? The simple answer, obviously, is no, both as far as Perón is concerned and as far as Carrijo is concerned. For his brilliant academic career, the Universidad de Buenos Aires awarded Carrijo a 2-year scholarship to perfect his knowledge in neuroscience in Europe. He visited medical institutions in Amsterdam, Paris, and Berlin. And it is likely that in Germany, in 1932, he attended a political meeting or rally with Adolf Hitler. In 1933, Carrijo was already back in Buenos Aires. He probably attended this out of curiosity, we don't know, but surely he had no contact with Germany and never visited again Germany after 1932. How does this make him an admirer of Hitler? That's a good question which politicians should answer, not historians. Okay, I'll move to the conclusion. So, to conclude, the debate over the country's position in World War II and the entry of Nazi war criminals and Nazi collaborators and sympathizers has raged in Argentina more than in any other neutral country or any other Latin American country. This has gone for decades and it still goes on. In a politically polarized society as Argentina, each decision of a Peronist government, past or present, is immediately linked to the supposed pro-German neutrality of the 1943 military regime, in which Perón was a key figure, and to the entry of war criminals such as Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele following the defeat of the Third Reich during Perón's first presidency. There is no better way to stain the image of a government in a democratic regime than to link it somehow to Nazism. The current war between Russia and Ukraine is the most recent example of the use and abuse of the past for national or political purposes, as Vladimir Putin characterized Zelensky as neo-Nazi, and the latter characterized Putin as Hitler. Too many war criminals, collaborators, and Nazi sympathizers entered Argentina in the post-World War II era. But a comparative perspective allows us to insist that Argentina was no exception. Many countries allowed in or actively recruited immigrants associated in one way or another with the Nazi regime. This was especially true as far as scientists, engineers, technicians, or military experts were concerned. Therefore, the efforts to portray Argentina as the safe haven for war criminals, they are problematic. By putting all the blame on Peronism, Argentine society has not confronted its own past and has avoided looking at itself in the mirror. Nazis and collaborators, as well as neo-Nazis and extreme right-wing organizations, enjoyed an immunity under different governments, military and civilian, authoritarian and democratic. Historians should distance themselves, or we historians should distance ourselves as much as possible from politically motivated accusations. At the same time, we must be aware that our research, no matter how meticulous and based on a wide variety of primary sources, would probably not convince either supporters of Peronism or enemies of Peronism, as most people tend to stick to their assumptions and would not let historical research or historians like ourselves to confuse them. Thank you very much.
If you want to sit down, you're welcome here. I guess it's better.
Okay, it's time for questions and comments and
Thank
protests.
Thank you very much,
and,
Raanan. Exactly. I would say I invite everybody of us to raise a question, to give a comment on your talk. I will be the moderator of this round, having a look also at the time, but I think we have the first question or comment. Yes, please.
Okay. Rein Zurov from the Wiesenthal Center. First of all, Professor Raanan, thank you very much for your very enlightening lecture about Argentina, but I have to say something that just something of a slight contra. There's no question that countries, Anglo-Saxon countries, admitted far more Nazis, United States, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, not as many, as Argentina. But the fact of the matter is people very often deal with history through symbols, okay? And Argentina has become a symbol for the reason, not only because there are more Nazi war criminals emigrated to Argentina than other countries in Latin America, but also because of the stature of those Nazi war criminals. Now, for example, you just mentioned Pavlich in passing. Pavlich was a person who conducted 3 genocides simultaneously. And he's just as bad as Eichmann and Mengele and others. So there's no question that many very important Nazi war criminals came to Argentina. And that's why Argentina has become a symbol, although I'm very glad that you raised the counter-argument and explained that lo kitzakata, okay, which means basically it's not as terrible as Argentina has been branded as the symbol. But there's no question that Argentina, as you admitted many of these people, and that's why she's suffering to this day. But one thing you didn't mention is that once the government made the switch to democracy, Argentina extradited Nazi war criminals to Croatia. That's how Dinko Šakić was put on trial in Zagreb. Nada Šakić was extradited. And the whole attitude was completely changed, and it's important to make that distinction also.
Thank you very much. You can.
Do I have to press anything?
No, I guess it's working perfectly.
So I'll give you a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is that basically we are completely in agreement. I agree with most of your arguments, first of all, as to the symbolic nature of things. And indeed, first and foremost, the entry of Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele single out Argentina as a place where Nazis could easily enter, that's for sure, and to some extent prosper. I say to some extent because it's not that Eichmann, for example, became a very important figure in Argentina in any way. Not, yeah, agreed. You know about this at least as much as I do, if not more than that. And I also agree that because of the amazing operation of kidnapping Eichmann, etc., less attention was given to heavy war criminals, heavy quote unquote, like Ante Pavelic, yeah, undoubtedly. When you say that when Argentina switched to democracy, it changed its policies. Well, Argentina switched to democracy several times during the second half of the 20th century. It switched to democracy with the election of Arturo Frondizi in 1958. Nobody would claim that Frondizi was anti-Semitic or in any way sympathizers with Nazi Germany or with extreme right-wing nationalists in his own country, and he wouldn't extradite any war criminal. The same goes for the presidency of Guido. So it took Argentina too long, and with this Latin American stubborn position, which can be understood historically, that we want to maintain our national sovereignty and we wouldn't let anyone interfere in our domestic affairs, and therefore if somebody has to be put to trial, he or she should be put to trial here, and we won't extradite any citizen of ours to another country. But it took Argentina too long to change its policy. I'm also willing to admit that in order to be slightly provocative and, create a discussion here, in a couple of sentences of mine, I went a bit to an extreme in order to somewhat challenge a too simplistic image of Argentina as being the one, and then maybe we shouldn't pay too much attention to what happened in Chile or Paraguay, Bolivia or Brazil. I mean, some of the infamous Nazis who started their journey in Argentina ended up in other countries. Weren't these countries also responsible? They were. Okay, but in not just in public discussions, even in scholarly discussions in academia, too little attention is given to other countries and other societies. This is, in a way, my main argument. It's not to, of course, not to justify, it's not to defend, it's not to, but it's a call to rethink some of the too simplistic assumptions that we have about about the countries where Nazi war criminals find refuge.
But it's because of the numbers and the stature.
Yes. Again, it depends if you limit your discussion to this specific legal category of war criminals, but as you said yourself, Anglo-Saxon countries opened their doors to very many Nazi supporters. Okay, yeah, that's my point. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have one more question, and I would suggest after this question we close the first session of discussions, because we have 2 days of panelists, and I encourage everybody also to refer in their discussions of their panels to the keynote to comment and ask again on Raanan. Please, we have a question here.
Shimon Samuels.
Could you take the microphone, please? Thank you.
Shimon Samuels, Simon Wiesenthal Center, Europe, also Latin America. You mentioned in passing CEANA.
Yeah.
And I, for my reasons, left CEANA at a certain point, and I would like to get your opinion of why it really failed. Secondly, there's a spurious idea was passed around, a directiva in Neuquén to bring Jews, Argentine Jews, and that would be a concentration camp. Have you ever heard of this? And if you have, I'd like to know what was the basis.
Thank you very much.
The CEANA, as I see it, was established mostly with the idea of bettering Argentina's image in the US and Western Europe. The CEANA failed to a large degree because it wasn't meant to provoke a discussion within Argentine society as to its responsibility as far as the entry of Nazi war criminals. It was a commission for export, if you'd like. And therefore, there were very few public events held in Argentina with members of the CEANA, public discussions. It was more important for the CEANA people to have a conference in Washington or in Tel Aviv than to have a conference in Buenos Aires, Rosario, Córdoba, Tucumán, or Bariloche. And I would have said that it was much more important to hold it in Buenos Aires, Rosario, Córdoba, Tucumán, and Bariloche than to hold it in Washington or Tel Aviv. But the aim was, first and foremost, we are talking about the Menem presidency. Menem tried to shift Argentine foreign policy, to leave aside the traditional resistance to US policies, a kind of a third world, a kind of a pro-third world foreign policy. So he tried to ally Argentina with the United States. And as part of this policy, the CEANA was created to better Argentina's image. Unlike, let's say, truth commissions in various countries, lack of material resources, lack of political support, in the way from the very first moment, assured the failure of this commission. I do not question the integrity of any member of this commission. The commission recruited first-rate scholars from around the world, and they certainly did their best in order to look for relevant documents in archives and documentation centers. But it came. The result was disappointing in very many ways. First and foremost, in not being able to provoke any serious discussion within Argentine society about these issues. This is how I see it, but I think that we have here people who were more involved than myself in this commission. I did publish, when I was the editor of Tel Aviv University's Journal of Latin American Studies, I did publish a special issue with articles written by members of the CEANA. I wanted to provoke some discussion on this in Israel, but otherwise I was not involved, and I was disappointed, as very many other people, with the final report presented by the CEANA. I'm sorry?
And the directive?
I heard about it. It's not something that I can comment on seriously. There have been so many rumors, and there are so many fantasies as to Argentina, Nazism in Argentina, and anti-Semitism in Argentina. My initial reaction is not to take this too seriously, but I say it with some caution because I'm not aware of any serious attempt to establish such a concentration camp in southern Argentina.
Okay.
Yeah.
A short comment, and I would suggest, please.
Yes.
Okay.
Professor Medin.
Thank you. You hear me? Okay. I thank you very much for your comments, and I have been a member of CEANA as well in the late 90s.
I know.
And my impression was not that it was a complete failure, but I agree that it was a commission for export. And my impression was that the president of Argentina, Menem, and his commission was not interested at all in the findings of this commission. A great interest had the foreign minister, Guido Di Tella. Right. He was interested, and he received us in the Palacio San Martin 2 times, and but it was not his commission. So it was a commission for export, and it was a question between the United States and Argentina, and not a question of historians doing their work. But on the other hand, there was a lot of work, of thorough research of different historians, and they published it as well in different sort of articles. And it was a gain of investigation, and we gained a lot of knowledge from this commission. The failure was that there was not a final publication. So the publication was in different books but not a final publication of that CEANA. This really was a failure, and it didn't change the image of Argentina. That's true, but a complete failure, it was not.
No,
This is my impression.
I would suggest taking these comments on CEANA, which sometimes reminds me also that in Austria we have the Historikerkommission, and with this idea maybe we can continue the next panels. What is the important role of these kind of reports, and for whom are they made for? I would suggest building the bridge between the important work of the CEANA report, it's the archival work we can find in there, I would suggest, to an archive we have in-house, represented now by Kinga and Marianne, because I think here we can have a guided tour. I think the tour is going to be here, digitally and in present, and so we can just jump into the next topic, but without forgetting what we heard and what we could maybe discuss in the next panels. So I would like to say thank you, Raanan, for your keynote. Thank you for the start of a hopefully 2-day ongoing discussion. And Kinga and Marianne, I think we just switch, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much for the first session.